Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the last session of the day of this beautiful conference. Our first speaker will be Erica Hunter from SOAS, University of London, and she will speak about a victim of the Seyfo, Adai Scher, I don't know, and his contribution to scholarship. Please.
To the organisers of the conference, particularly Shabo Talai, who very kindly invited me. Well, my paper is going to be a simple paper, not focusing on politics, but focusing on a dimension that is of great relevance today, cultural destruction. We are seeing, of course, sadly today, the destruction of manuscripts, etc., taking place under the auspices of Daesh. So I want to look at the greater issue of cultural destruction seen through the contribution of Adai Scher to scholarship. Well, His Grace Ibrahim Adai Scher was the Chaldean Catholic Archbishop of Siirt in southeast Turkey, was born in Şaklawa on the 3rd of March 1867. Şaklawa was a village 51 kilometres northeast of Erbil, now in the KRG administered region of Iraq. He came from a priestly family and he learnt classical Syriac at an early age. Like many bright boys, he joined in 1880 the famous Dominican seminary in Mosul, where he was able to receive the best standards available in education at the time. French was the language of instruction, but he also learned Latin and studied theology and philosophy at the Dominican seminary. He returned to his hometown Şaklawa in 1889 to be a teacher in the local village church school, but of course, a talented young man, he soon came to the notice of his superiors and was appointed bishopric assistant in Kirkuk, where in addition to his linguistic skills in Arabic, Turkish and Persian, he furthered his repertoire of modern European languages, German and English. So he was a very great linguist. In 1902, he was consecrated by the Chaldean Patriarch of Babylon as Bishop of the Diocese of Siirt in Western Bohtan, and took up his duties there. 6 years later, in 1908, he travelled to Istanbul, where he met the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II, and travelled further on to Rome, where he met Pope Pius X, and perhaps following in the footsteps of Rabban Sauma in the 13th century, he went on to Paris. If we recall, Rabban Sauma went to Paris, recorded his impressions of Paris in the 13th century. Well, during Adai Scher's sojourn in Paris, he made contacts, particularly with the publishing house Firmin Didot, that were to be very important in promoting his scholarly career. Tragically, this was to span less than a decade, but the works that he produced, which I will focus on, particularly the Liber Scholiorum, have contributed enormously to not only Syriac studies, but also to more general Christian studies and even Manichaean studies. So, prior to his departure in 1908 to Europe, Scher had already shown his scholarly inclinations by producing 2 catalogues of manuscripts which were printed by the Dominican fathers in Mosul. And when I was in Mosul, you could still see all the books that they had produced in their press, and you could buy them too. he produced a catalogue of Syriac manuscripts in the Chaldean Patriarchate at Mosul. George Kiraz has described this as an immensely valuable reference work, and it had a whole range of genres: liturgical texts, hagiography, ascetical works, philosophy, grammar, letters, and history. So all the manuscripts at Mosul. The second catalogue which Scher compiled was the holdings of his episcopate in Sirte. The catalogue des manuscrits syriaques et arabes conservés dans la Bibliothèque épiscopale de Sirte was produced in 1905 and again revealed a very valuable holdings of manuscripts, listing basically 136 Syriac manuscripts. Sadly, these works were consigned to the flames in 1915 when the Turks burnt the library. Continuing his interest to catalogue manuscripts, Scher published in Journal Asiatique in 1907 the episcopal holdings of Diyarbakir. So he methodically went around and catalogued the manuscript holdings. We don't know what has happened to the holdings at Diyarbakir, but what he has produced has been very valuable in allowing us to know what there was. He did publish one work in Arabic a year later, in 1908, with the Catholic press in Beirut, but thereafter his works, which were essentially translations of Syriac manuscripts in the libraries to which he had access, would be solely published in Europe, principally by Firmin Didier in Paris. His translation into French of the famous 10th century Arabic Chronicle of Sirte, subtitled Histoire Nestorienne Inédite, was of course made from an unpublished manuscript from the library in Sirte. Scher was, of course, a Chaldean, but he was deeply aware of the great educational heritage of the Church of the East, which it had had down the centuries, and continuing that interest, he published in 1908, again with Firmin Didier, the French translation of the 6th century work Cause de la Fondation des Écoles Bahaj Beshabba Arbaya Évêque de Helwan. So he published two major works in 1908. In 1911, again with Firmin Didier, Scher published, and I should go on to, this is of course, Scher's his picture, you're probably all familiar. In 1911, he published the Traité d'Issaï, le Docteur et de Hanana de Adiabeni sur les martyrs. This was an important work on one of the most controversial figures of the Nestorian Church. If we just recall, Henana's directorship at Nisibis in the 570s broke with the exegetical tradition that had centered on the works of Theodore of Mopsuestia. He showed some preference for the Chalcedonian teachings and was particularly attracted to the writings of John Chrysostom, whose philosophical and homiletical method of hermeneutics appealed to him over and above the more literal and historical approach of Theodore the interpreter. This, of course, did land him into hot water with his colleagues, but I can't continue that vein here. But it was a very important work. In what was probably his most monumental pursuit, which I will focus on, Scher produced a critical edition of Theodore Barconi's Liber Scholiorum, published between 1910 and 1912, part of the prestigious Corpus Scriptorum Christianorum Orientalium in the series Syriaca section. Barkoni was Bishop of Kashgar in the Diocese of Bet Aramaya in southern Iraq near the Umayyad garrison city of Al-Wasit. We focus so much on the north in considering the history of Christianity. We often forget that in the early Abbasid period there was a very thriving expression of the Church of the East and also the Syrian Orthodox Church in southern Iraq. Barkoni came from southern Iraq. He wrote his Liber Scholiorum in the late 8th century. This was a great period of intellectual fervour, and with works being produced in philosophy, etc., in the newly established city of Baghdad. And of course it was the time of the great intellectual exchanges, the most famous being the dialogue between Patriarch Timothy I with the third Abbasid Caliph Mahdi. He's writing this book at a time of a fruitful intellectual exchange, and it's interesting that Adair chose to produce a critical edition of this very important work. The Liber Scholiorum had passed down in various manuscripts belonging to two recensions, Sirt and Urmia. Now, the Urmia line, both recensions, Urmia and Sirt, appear to have derived from an archetype manuscript written in 791-792. But the Urmia recension is rather minor compared to the Sirt recension. The only copies we have come from the final years of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th century, and in two cases manuscripts were copied to order. One of those manuscripts is in the Staatsbibliothek, Berlin Oriental Quarto 1143. Berlin Oriental Quarto 871, and so you can have a look at that, but that is a copy from the late 19th century. The Sirt line was very much more distinguished lineage, and the Sirt used as the basis for his critical edition Paris Syriac 366, which you will find on the top under 1, and it's been dated between the 9th and the 11th centuries. He used that as the foundation text. He recorded variants between this text with other manuscripts that were in his personal disposal, namely Sirt 23, which was copied in, this is a 16th century manuscript, that was destroyed in 1915. And if we go down to 3 on that list, Diyarbakir, which was again a 16th century manuscript, the location we do not know. What has happened to the Diyarbakir collection? Well, Paris Syriac 366, as I said, was dated between the 9th and the 11th century. It is now in the Bibliothèque Nationale and bears the class mark, as I have said, Paris Syriac 366. Cher recorded as Sirt 24 in his catalogue. It was originally part of the holdings at Sirt of the Episcopal Library, but prior to the outbreak of World War I, and I'd be very interested if anyone has any information, he sold it to the Bibliothèque Nationale. For how much and why, I do not know. But he sold this very precious 9th to 11th century manuscript to Paris, and just as well he did, because otherwise it would have been burnt. And I'm not advocating that libraries sell their manuscripts, but that is just fortunate that he did. So The first description of the manuscript he recorded as parchment, consisting of 21 quires, each of 10 leaves, and he talks a little bit more about the manuscript, and he says it was written in a very careful hand. The next manuscript, from which is derivative really from Cert 24, was Cert 23, written in 1539. Again, unfortunately, it was destroyed, but we have a description in Scher's catalogue where he says it was 33 quires of 10 folios, 27 lines per leaf, and he gives the title. And he noted the division of contents into 11 books, with the 11th dealing with all different sects and religions. There are other 3 manuscripts which I am not going to comment upon. It's longer in my paper. Alcosh 50, British Library, and Pognon. These are later copies. Diyarbakir, which was produced in 1608, he drew attention to this manuscript as Codex 21 in his 1907 catalogue, 26 quires of 10 leaves each, and gives the title page, again noting the division of the work into 11 books, and dates the original, and the date of the original composition of the work, i.e. the Liber Scholium, in the year 1103 of Alexander, i.e. 792. But then the colophon reveals that the manuscript was completed at the monastery of John the Solitary in 1608. Of course, it gives Seleucid dating 1919, but it was 1608. Now, Scher's close study of the various manuscripts of the Liber Scholiorum was extremely valuable. However, he incurred the umbrage of the great German scholar Anton Baumstark, who savagely criticised his findings and argued that in selecting Paris Syriac 366, remember Cert 24, as the base text, it was the worst foundation that he had chosen. I think there's a little bit of sour grapes here, because the Königlichen Library in Berlin had commissioned the Urmia line of the Liber Scholiorum. So I don't take Baumstark's comments as being entirely objective on this point. However, Scher's findings have been upheld by the recent translation of the French scholars of Hespel and Draguet. Scher never translated the Liber Scholiorum. His life was cut short. He probably would have, but that was left to Hespel and Draguet, who I think 60 or 70 years later translated the Liber Scholiorum. And they acknowledged that all manuscripts have ultimately derived from an early prototype, but of course the most ancient line is that of the Cert recension, and they have upheld Scher's findings in their publication. And so his work was vindicated much later on. And Hespel and Draguet do pronounce that basically Scher's findings were sound, and that Cert 23 and Diyarbakir, the Diyarbakir manuscript ultimately come from Paris Syriac 366, or a very similar text to that. And I think I have my final, yes, you can see the stemma of the manuscript. Well, so I've given you a brief synopsis, very truncated synopsis of Scher's work. In the mayhem that, of course, took place in Cert in 1915, Scher managed to secure the safe passage of some of his community by bribing the Turkish governor. I wonder how much that took place. I'm sure that a lot of money was exchanged for lives. It would be very interesting to investigate. Tragically, Sher was not to be so fortunate. A Turkish ayah hid the bishop in his house, gave him safe custody, but ultimately his location was betrayed. An eyewitness account of his last hours relates how amidst jeers and taunts of the Turkish soldiers, Sher was humiliated, taken outside the city and killed on the 21st of June. His murderers then decapitated him so they could present his head to the governor, and I wonder what sort of remuneration they received from the governor. I'm sure there must have been some remuneration. His Grace was only 48 years old when he was so brutally killed. In less than 10 years, he had made remarkable contributions to Syriac studies in various ways. His catalogues documented the manuscripts held in the libraries of Mosul, Sirt, and Diyarbakir, upholding the cultural treasures of the Christian communities who had dwelt for centuries in the regions, and transmitted priceless texts. He made critical editions of text and translations, making these works accessible for European scholars, and thus opened new dimensions in scholarship, enabling scholars to enrich their minds. And finally, his magisterial critical edition of Theodore Barconi's Liber Scholiorum released one of the greatest works produced in the Abbasid period, valuable to scholars of Christianity, and as I said, even to Manichaeism, which is how I first encountered the Liber Scholiorum. By utilising the ancient manuscripts that were at his disposal in Sirt and Diyarbakir and Mosul, Sher was able to reconstruct a reliable recension history for the Liber Scholiorum back to its origins in the first millennium. This beacon of intellectual enlightenment was extinguished by barbarians who also burnt the priceless manuscript holdings. Today, when I look at his catalogues in the University Library, Cambridge, one can only lament at the shocking loss of life and also the destruction of the cultural heritage, not only of the Syriac Christians, but that of greater scholarship. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting lecture on such questions, which also involves other and further discussions. I would be able to open it now. For now, I call Sabri Atman from the Clark University and the Seyfo Center.
Before I proceed with my talk today, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this conference for the invitation they have to extend it to me, which honors me greatly. The year of 1915 is well remembered by today's Assyrian as the year of the sword. The sword beheaded 2 out of 3 Assyrians. This is why the Assyrians called this genocide Seyfo or Sepa, meaning the sword in our language. There has been a lot of progress in recognizing the Assyrian genocide the last few years. First of all, thanks to Theha Hallo and Adam Jones, International Genocide Scholar Association of officially recognized the Assyrian and Greek genocide 2007. And then Sweden, Armenia, the Netherlands, Vatican, and Austria have recognized the Assyrian genocide. I am sure in the very near future, the number of the countries who will recognize the Assyrian, Armenian, and Greek genocide will increase dramatically, and Turkey will have and more difficult by its denial policy. However, my speech today will be a brief analysis from a gender perspective and the experience of the Assyrian women during the genocide. The scholarly focus on both the Holocaust and the Armenian or Assyrian genocide was not gender neutral. On contrary, it privileged the male experiences. History shows that males and females have often been affected by the genocide in different ways, whether as victims or as perpetrators. Focusing on aspects such as gender is important if one seeks to fully understand the modes, motive, dynamic, and consequences of the genocide and other mass crimes. When the ultimate goal of the perpetrators is to secure the disappearance of an entire group of people, men, women, and children-related matters such as sexual abuse, or whether or what extent factors like gender or age played a role in the selection of the victims may seem of secondary importance. Rape is a deliberate act of dominance and violence that targets women's sexuality and gender roles. Like all rape, genocide rape, and other forms of sexual violence, such as abduction, sexual enslavement, is particular as well of the generic. The treatment against women, such as abduction or rape, is an official policy during the genocidal period. It is regularly used as weapons of the war to further the military and political goals of the parties engaged in the conflict. This policy is not only a policy of the pleasure of male power, which happens also in the time of peace. It is not only a policy to torture, humiliate, and demoralize the other side, which happens often in war conflict. It is policy by organizers of genocide, and especially rape is under orders. This is not policy out of control. It is policy under control. It is also a policy to kill and to make the victims wish they were dead instead of the pain and suffering they endure. It is violence against women as an instrument of forced exile to make them leave their homes, their relatives, and never want to go back. Rape and enslavement is policy to destroy people and whole society, to make them feel they are nothing anymore. It is difficult to say to what extent rape and enslavement were used during the genocide of 1915. But it is not difficult to say that many perpetrators took advantage under these circumstances. They raped and abducted many Armenian and Assyrian women. The sensitivity of the gender aspect of genocide against Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks has been ignored largely in the analysis of the genocide of 1915. I will now attempt to examine the role of gender in the Assyrian genocide by presenting to you first a brief portion of the Ishaq Armale testimony. Yesterday and today, many speakers mentioned Ishaq Armalto. Second, Joseph Naim's testimony. And third, the story of one of the many Assyrian females who were targeted for physical destruction, sexual abuse, slavery, forced marriage, and forced assimilation. Ishaq Armale was an eyewitness of the events in 1914-1918 from Mardin and reproduced these happenings within his memoir, as well as relative story of the events in 1895. His testimony was published under the title of Al-Qassara fi Nakabat Al-Nasara. My Arabic is not that good. The calamities of the Christian in Lebanon, 1919. He wrote down everything he was involved with and also what was told to him by other witnesses of this monstrous event. Armalto did not distinguish much in his narrative between the victims if they were Assyrian or Armenians. According to him, caravans of women from Diyarbakir began arriving in Mardin from July 5th to 15 in 1915. They were also children. The good-looking boys and girls were taken out of the groups and brought to Muslim homes, where they would be then reside. Those who remained in the groups had to continue walking towards Viran Shehir and Rasul Ain. When the people reached the towns, they were stripped of their clothes and slaughtered. The bodies of victims were thrown in the caves and wells. After witnessing, the perpetrators took all of their clothing, jewelry, and spiritual valuables. A second female caravan from Diyarbakir to Mardin arrived on the 8th of July. This time also the perpetrators seized their jewelry and clothing. A man by the name of Sadiq, son of Ali Tarzi, chose two beautiful girls to take to the brother. He obliged them to renounce their faith, but the girls refused to do so. He then took them south of the town, undressed, and raped them, after which they were killed. Armalto says that another perpetrator named Chachano also kidnapped two beautiful girls from the same group Tarzi did. In addition to taking the girls and money and jewelry, Chachano went a step further in his treatment of these girls. He misled them into believing that he would protect them from evil and allow them to live. After 2 nights in his home, he began to torture and rape them. The third caravan of women from Diyarbakir shortly afterward on the transport trucks. There were about 400 women in this group. The perpetrators separated the boys and girls from their mothers. The women were taken away and to a secluded spot where they were stripped naked and murdered. The children were transferred to Mardin and auctioned of the Muslim families. A fourth female caravan then reached Mardin. These accounts confirm that age does not play a role in who is selected as victims of rape. What is essential to these perpetrators is that the victims are feminine and beautiful. Women were abducted from their homes through dizzy misrepresentation and lies. Some of the lies included telling the woman that the man who reality had been previously abducted had sent for their wives. The soldier manipulated the woman into hand over their jewelry, clothes, and other valuables, stating that they would keep them safe. The women were told they would get their belongings back when they arrived to where the men were. All of this was a lie, of course. A vehicle containing to the women's belongings fled from the area and the valuables were delivered to the government building. The first caravan of women traveling by foot, which Armale wrote about, was from Viran Shehir. As the group approached Tel Armin, one of the older ladies was tried to and remained some distance away from the rest. The soldiers went to her, then rejoined the rest of the group, where they told the woman she had been killed. Kurds attacked the group and tried to kidnap the girls and the small children. Those who escaped reached and the new group of soldiers who took command over them. Those in the caravans believed that the journey into Viran Shehir was a prone delay and in their deaths. Between July 16-17, the massacre of the group began. The victims were stripped, naked, and placed in trucks. Ishaq Armalto goes in details what happened to the Assyrian and Armenian women in Viran Shehir, Diyarbakir, and Mardin. The second testimony is from Naim. Naim also gives details in his memoirs what happened to the Assyrian women and girls who were abducted by Kurds mostly and were raped and were forced to be Muslim. I will skip the testimonies of Joseph Naim because I want to keep the time. The genocide of 1915 in the Ottoman Turkey provides primary examples of such of war crimes. They bring focus to the issue of intolerance exercised against Christians, an intolerance that is being violently demonstrated 100 years later in Syria, Iraq, Libya, and elsewhere in the Middle East today. The story that I retell here is drawn from one of those that I have gathered from among Assyrians living in Sweden, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, all countries to which Assyrians have fled for security and diminished systematic discrimination that has been their lot in the Middle East. I choose this very personal story of an Assyrian woman to illustrate the complex role of gender in the Assyrian genocide. Many Assyrian females, as we learn also from Armelto and Naim's testimonies, were targeted for physical destruction, sexual abuse, slavery, and forced marriage or forced assimilation. Here is Yadesade's story. When Assyrian men were killed and children were abducted and made part of Muslim households, women were forcefully taken also. These women were forced to convert to Islam and marry Kurds, Turks, and Arabs. In 1915, Yadesade, that you see in the picture, was among too many who witnessed terrible events during the Armenian and Assyrian genocide, including the killing of her brothers and rape of other Christian women like her. 14 years old, when she was abducted with 7 other Assyrian women, she was taken to a Kurdish village to Koza, not far from Mardin, in southeastern Turkey. Once there, Yade had only one option if she wanted to survive: to marry a Muslim man and convert to Islam. During her captivity, Yadesade attempted to escape 4 times and return to her Assyrian village of Hapses. However, initially she failed. Her captors controlled her every move and watched her constantly. For her, the Muslim town where she was held captive was like a prison, as was her marriage to the Kurdish man. A few months after the marriage was consummated, Yadesade became pregnant and gave birth to a boy who was named Hassan. After the birth of Hassan, the Kurds reduced their clothes, watched Yadesade, because experience has taught them that even once non-Muslim would not have the fortitude to escape and leave her child behind. But they were wrong. When Hassan was 3 months old, Yade ran away on foot. Finally, she was free, though separated from her child. She finally reached Hapses. Many years later, she remarried to an Assyrian man, this time, and bore 4 children. She tried very deliberately to remember her past. Despite all she had endured, she concentrated on enjoying a happy life with her new family. Perhaps you are wondering what happened to the first baby she left behind. The Kurds called her first child infidel Hassan. His fellow villagers often jeered by having this label thrown at him as he was growing up by those among them whom he lived. They believed Hassan had defected because his mother had abandoned him. He grew up with the Kurdish father and the rest of family, but never forgot that he had a long-gone mother. When Hassan turned 18 years, he began the search for his mother. After much questioning, he discovered the name of the village in which she was living. He knew that his mother had remarried and had other children but still wanted to see her. So he went to her village. When Hassan arrived at her house, Yadisade refused to see him. For nearly 2 decades, she had tried to forget she had a Muslim child. And when he found her, she claimed that he was lying. She did not want to see him. Many times Hassan attempted to see his mother, but she continues to refuse. Finally, Hassan stopped trying and went back home, but he didn't want to give up. He made 2 more trips to his mother village, but she insisted again and again she wanted nothing to do with him. Every time anyone tried to broach the subject for a first son, she would cry and deny having another son. I wondered why, as you might also. 2 reasons emerged. First, because of the woman's personal trauma and history of abuse that she tried to forget, and second, from the shame in the Assyrian social setting that associated with giving birth to a Muslim child. In her social milieu, when confronted with rape, as she was, she could have committed suicide, as many Assyrian and Armenian women were expected to do and did. Hassan tried to see his mother 4 times altogether. On the last visit, he sent his mother an entreaty through a respected elder from a village. She finally acquiesced, but she said would only give him 5 minutes. Yadisade told him she forgave him. He kissed her hand and they embraced, both weeping after the 5 minutes. She told him to leave and said she would never want to see him again. I need 3 minutes more. Is it okay?
1 minute.
Thank you. Oh. On his way out of his mother's house, Hassan met a young man who turned out to be of her sons, his half-brother named Ibrahim Amnu. Ibrahim, like many others from the region of Turkey, immigrated to Switzerland, where he now lives. The 2 stayed in touch many years. I will show you more pictures. Yeah. Although I did not have the privilege of interviewing Hassan, I did meet and interview 2 of his half-brothers, Yadesade's Assyrian son, one living in Switzerland and the other lived in Germany in Augsburg. I am also in contact with Hassan's children who live in Izmir in Turkey. Yadesade's descendants now, this story, the tragic story, she tried hard to forget. Infidel Hassan passed away some years ago. Thank you. Thank you for
Thank you very much for your lecture and also for your discipline. Thank you. And now I call Alda Benjamin from the University of Maryland, Washington. Pardon me, with a lecture on negotiating gender relations in the aftermath of Seyfo and Simele.
Yes.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to speak. Before I begin my presentation, I want to give you a background on how I came to this topic. My paper is entitled Negotiating Gender Relations in the Aftermath of Seyfo and Simele. My dissertation contextualized the Assyrians, Nestorians, Chaldeans, and Syriacs in Iraqi history by analyzing their role in ideological and social movements of the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century. I was also interested in the representation of women by intellectuals, along with gender relations in the Assyrian community and Iraqi society. In examining these issues, it became evident to me that Assyrian intellectuals, especially those who had survived Seyfo and Simele, were still influenced by their earlier experiences, which led me to the study that is still a research in progress. My approach has thus far been grounded in Middle East history as opposed to genocide studies, and I would very much appreciate any advice from you at the end. The discourse of women's liberation during the interwar period was vigorously debated in Iraqi and Syrian intellectual circles. Syria had granted women the right to vote in 1949 and was a country Arab intellectuals were striving to model after. This paper will analyze the way in which generally Assyrian male intellectuals and some women engage with the discourse of women's emancipation in newspapers published by the community mainly in Iraq in the second half of the 20th century. It will question whether the Assyrian survivors of Seyfo and Simmel espoused notions of patriotic motherhoods. For instance, were Assyrian intellectuals, like Syrian Iraqi ones, affected by a crisis of paternity due to the destabilization of the patriarch's authority and the changing female roles? This paper will attempt to answer these questions and also shed light on the intellectual engagements of Assyrians attempting to rebuild their community and negotiate gender relations in the aftermath of Seyfo and Simmel. Elizabeth Thompson's notion of crisis of paternity holds that social, political, and economic problems after World War I led to the destabilization of the patriarch's authority and to changing female roles. As a result of this destabilization, Syrian women negotiated with their patriarchy by adapting gender roles associated with patriotic motherhood in the 1930s. Women accepted conventional gender roles, for example, domestic responsibilities and charitable work, as their national duties. Assyrian and Armenian refugees had settled in Syria following 1915, only to be followed with another wave of Assyrian refugees coming from Iraq in the 1930s and 1940s, escaping the Simmel massacre perpetrated by the Iraqi army in 1933. Of this population, Thompson states that 13% of the Assyrian refugees had households run by matriarchs, so their husbands or fathers were killed or missing somehow. Again, a contributing factor to the complicated gender roles during this period. Before I examine Assyrian publications from this period, I'd like to provide the context for gender negotiations discussed in Iraqi and Syrian societies that Assyrian intellectuals, in turn, contributed to and were influenced by. Gender relations and the position of women were debated in press associated with the Iraqi Effendiya, men born in the first decades of the 20th century, and westernized in dress, education, and the types of professions they were employed in. For example, they were employed as engineers, as civil servants. Newspapers written by the Iraqi Effendiya between the 1940s and 1950s that I've examined included Sada al-Ahali and Liwa al-Istiqlal. In my analysis, I observed some differences between the more Arab nationalist newspaper Liwa al-Istiqlal and the Iraqi leftist Sada al-Ahali. Liwa al-Istiqlal argued for granting women the voting rights, and this is all happening at the same time where Syria grants women the right to vote. Argued for granting women voting rights because they contributed to the betterment of society through education, work, and patriotism. Whereas Sada al-Ahali supported this discourse, but argued for the emancipation of women on the basis of ethics. Since women were humans, they were to participate fully, and not only because they earned this right. If women did not have full democratic access to all aspects of the Iraqi state, then the rights already attained by other segments of society, that is men, were conditional. All rights, Sada al-Ahali argued, were interconnected. The discourse on women's rights in the Iraqi press was part of a larger discourse in the Middle East. After all, women's movement had developed in some Middle Eastern countries in the mid-19th century, particularly in Syria. The women's movement also acquired nationalist ideologies as women supported men in demonstrations and military battles against the French in the 1920s. Ensuring political rights for women became an indicator of not only Iraq's progress, but that of the Arab world in the views of the Effendiya. So how did Assyrian intellectuals contribute to this debate? And what was the impact of Seyfo on gender relations? An article appearing in Safro Sorioyo, a publication associated mainly with the Syriac Orthodox community in Syria, which was published in 1945, this particular article, about the modern woman, contributed to the intellectual discussions of women's role in society. The writer began by offering a congratulatory message to the community members of the Syriac Orthodox community in Mosul for the formation of a group called Ladies of Compassion. He agreed with writers in earlier editions on this issue and stated that the Ladies of Compassion and the women's movement in general could be of benefit to the nation. However, he opposed certain positions, especially with regards to women's liberation. In his opinion, a woman's primary role was to her family and household. The most important knowledge she should acquire was related to raising good children, who will, in time, become men worthy of the society and nation they belong to. He argued that modernization was important, but that it shouldn't be acquired at the expense of cultural traditions and norms. One can speculate that the writer of this article had either experienced Seyfo firsthand or was a descendant of the survivors. The loss of loved ones and memories of tragedies would have led to a crisis of paternity for him and the community that he grew up in, as noted by Elizabeth Thompson. And the notion of patriotic motherhood seems to apply to his analysis. In the end of his article, the author argued that female readers, those who had adopted the modern principles, to read his article without hating him or considering him illiterate. This again alludes to an ongoing debate and alternatively attests to the transnationalism of the community. Not only was he aware of the creation of a women's group in Mosul, but he also engaged in discourses that affected them. The magazine included other contributors from Mosul as well, and one can assume that the Iraqi Assyrian community was reciprocating by negotiating in these gender negotiations, by engaging in these gender negotiations, but most importantly, in remembering Seyfo. So how are they remembering Seyfo? In Iraq, survivors of Seyfo carried their memories, and the trauma of their experiences were exhibited decades later, both by members of their generation and also by their descendants. Nanase Awrahim of the village of Gulpashan, Urmiya, was a survivor of this genocide in which she lost her father and many relatives, but managed to escape and hide out for months prior to joining around 40,000 Assyrians who eventually fled to Iraq. On her dying bed in 1935 in Baghdad, Nanase completed her 68 four-lined poetic stanza in Aramaic, detailing her experience during the genocide and the vivid accounts of the murder of her father and other family members, beginning on July 18, 1918. As discussed already by numerous scholars, and the documentary we watched yesterday, and of course just recently by Sabri Atman, nudity and rapes were common practices experienced by women. In the village of Gulpashan in Urmiya region, the crisis of paternity highlighted by Elizabeth Thompson is recalled as Kurdish forces were reported to have killed only the men and taking the women as spoils of war. Like many accounts of female survivors, Nanase experienced shame and degradation. In her poetry, shame takes on a different form and perhaps alludes to her previous high socio-economic status in society. She writes, "I wore tattered and worn-out clothes just like a beggar." She further gives us a glimpse of a heart-wrenching scene as she travels back to an earlier reality forever changed for her. "One day I went and revisited Gulpashan. I traversed its alleyways. Oh, and what did I witness? Elderly men and women killed and left on doorsteps. The sick were consumed by flames in a burning place. Those alleyways that had once been lovely and rare are filled with bones, clothes, and bloody human hair. All those beautiful buildings are destroyed and burned. Our holy temples are stripped, naked, and tainted." Again, she writes this decades later, in 1935. These memories of trauma continue to be experienced in future decades by Iraqi Assyrians and exhibited in cultural mediums. Shimon Butchmuel, a recent high school graduate and an active member of the Syrian Cultural Club, lifted the veil from the Semel massacre by presenting a song, Semel, entitled Semel, in August 1973, on the 3rd anniversary of the opening of the club in Baghdad. This song captured the community's social memory of the Semel massacre perpetrated by the Iraqi army in August 1933. The word massacre in this song was repeated 11 times. This would have contradicted official government accounts, both in the past and the present for his time frame, which represented the massacre as a suppression of a militia challenging the sovereignty of the Iraqi state. Further pointing to the transnational character of the community, songs produced by the diaspora by Assyrian singers between the late 1970s and early 1980s compared the Assyrian armed resistance against the Ba'ath regime to earlier battles fought by Assyrians during Seyfo. The destruction of Assyrian villages in the 1970s and 80s during the Anfal campaign, later on by the Iraqi state, were compared to villages destroyed during Seyfo as well. Similarly, Assyrian political and nationalist leaders executed by the Ba'ath party came to be identified as martyrs or sahdim. I argue that a cult of martyrdom developed by Assyrians during this period, which utilized popular culture in the format of songs, images, and memorials, within the liberated spaces of the Iraqi opposition, which were, if you think, they are active in the Iraqi north, and there's a Kurdish groups, there's also communists who are active, and among others. Of the Iraqi opposition and the Assyrian diaspora, which easily circulated, crossing borders given the ease of the production of modern technology, such as cassette tapes. Therefore, the memory of the survivors and their descendants lingered and had repercussions on gender relations, especially amongst the generations witnessing Seyfo and Semel, as was exhibited in their press and popular culture. So returning to the subject of the press, I focus on Murdana al-Turaya, which is a magazine which is associated by the Assyrian Culture Club. There are numerous reasons why Murdana al-Turaya provides an excellent case study for secular Assyrian intellectuals during the second half of the 20th century, including the representation of women and gender issues within the community. The magazine was published between 1972 and 1985 in both Arabic and Aramaic. It was widely circulated and it was widely circulated on a regular basis, with new issues appearing every 3 months. 2,000 copies were printed and distributed in Baghdad, Kirkuk, and northern provinces, and Basra, as well as in the region and Western countries. The letters to the editors sent from various Iraqi provinces, such as including Lebanon, the UK, the United States, and Yugoslavia, illustrates the magazine's broad readership. Moreover, in an interview with the president of the club in 1984, at a time when the magazine had become a shadow of its former self due to Iraqi government restrictions, he reported that 500 copies of Murdana al-Turaya had been sent outside of Iraq to organizations, clubs, and individuals residing in North America, Britain, France, Italy, Greece, Australia, and our Arab countries. The overall finances of the magazine determined the number of copies the editorial board could afford to print, which was also regulated by the Iraqi Ministry of Internal Affairs, and no profits were made from copies distributed outside of the country. Contributors straddle generational divisions, those writing in Aramaic generally being older, and many having witnessed Seyfo and Semel, while those writing in Arabic tended to be more of mixed age groups, and I can discuss that maybe in the question and answer period. This diversity extended to ideological leanings as well, though the magazine tended to express secular, leftist, and progressive ideals. Women's and gender-related issues were also covered in both Arabic and the Aramaic language sections of the magazine, with some marked differences. Famous Assyrian female athletes and honorary students were featured in the pages of the magazine. For example, Regina Shemshan, an Assyrian engineering student at the University of Baghdad, who had come first in the Iraqi women's chess tournament held in the capital, was mentioned. Murdana al-Turaya featured an interview with her in the Aramaic language section and republished an article that appeared in the Ba'athist Iraqi newspaper Al-Thawra. The magazine's reports on activities of Syrian Culture Club, which it was affiliated with, and other organizations across the country included stories about women. Finally, both male and female intellectuals engage in gender-related discussions, negotiating the role of Assyrian women in the club as well as a community-driven agendas such as cultural and linguistic revivals, along with their role in progressing the country. These issues were sometimes featured in the Arab-Iraqi press as well. For instance, a contribution titled Fatah Jami'iyya, a university student in Arabic, was a short story about a young woman named Evelyn. Evelyn had a secret that was consuming her thoughts and leading to internal tension and self-doubt. She was ashamed of facing her society, and particularly her family. The writer intertwined elements that led to the reader to understand her shame to be honor-related, and question whether she had been involved in sexually illicit activity or other culturally unacceptable forms of conduct between men and unmarried or unrelated women. Yet to the surprise of the reader, Evelyn's nightmare passed as she awakened from her sleep to jubilant news from her mother informing her that she had passed her university exams. Evelyn's shame was based on her fear of failing her exams. The author of the story seemed to suggest that education and success were as important as traditional societal expectations of women. Other pieces focus on the role of mothers as the preservers of culture and language, especially during periods when the standardization and modernization of the Aramaic language were being discussed. In the Aramaic language section, an article written by Bint Binyamid Ashita, Mudi La Yimma in Aramaic, What is a Mother?" painted a positive image of motherhood and elevated mothers' immeasurable value. He elaborated on the responsibilities shared between a mother and son, engaged in a healthy relationship. When describing a mother's duty, he went beyond the immediate issue of nurturing and caring for children and included the task of instilling the right values and raising a righteous son who loved his family, nation, and church. This narrative contrasted with that of a university student, where the first story complicated traditional interpretations of the role of women in society, while the second entrenched them further. It also points to the diversity of opinion in Mordone Aturaya and alludes to the intergenerational nature of the body of intellectuals contributing to the magazine, and furthermore, to the continued repercussions of Seyfo and Simmel on the generation that survived the genocide, and the representation of women and gender issues in their communities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And may I perhaps ask the speakers to sit beside me so that I can open the discussion, or can also leave your questions. Yes, please. Over here.
Just a comment for Dr. Hunter. You were asking about the fate of the Diyarbakir manuscripts. I was doing some research at the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library in Minnesota last year. I did a month and a half, and I was going through some manuscripts belonging to the Chaldean Catholic Church, their various manuscript collections, and I actually discovered that the most valuable of the Diyarbakir manuscripts have been transferred either to Mosul or to the Chaldean Patriarch in Baghdad, and that the rest of the collection had been merged with that of Mardin. And my friend, who is the Chaldean Catholic priest in Istanbul, actually confirmed that for me.
Thank you, Nicholas. I knew that they'd gone to Baghdad. The big question is, of course, where they've gone since then.
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
I knew that they'd left Diyarbakir. They were not destroyed, but we just don't know where they are. But I'll write to Columba. That's fine.
Okay.
Yep.
And just a correction about the place of death of Mar ad-Desher. He was actually seeking refuge with a Kurdish agha in the village of Tanze, which is maybe 10 or 15 kilometers to the south of Sirt, and that's where he was found and killed outside of that village. So he wasn't actually murdered in the city of Sirt. Fine. But thank you for your contribution.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas.
Over here.
I can thank you for the presentation. Just a short contribution. Actually, the production of gender roles in literature can help to understand better, maybe, or enrich our understanding, our knowledge about the impacts of Seyfo genocide. So I recently get in touch or just try to elaborate more on the Turkish literature. So usually what happens in gender roles, how constructed, reconstructed, or produced gender roles towards minorities. So usually an author discovers a grandmother who were, as Sabri mentioned, converted a Christian grandmother, either Armenian, Pontus Greek, or Assyrian. So maybe it can be, give a good opening. That's just a contribution. My question is, what about Surme Hanım? So how do you analyze Surme Hanım Alda from gender perspective? Do you see any patterns or just... And also, in relation to Surme Hanım, as far as I know, the most known public figure, female public figure among our society, especially when we're discussing that period. What about this? Still, just yeah, the question, clear.
Thank you for your question. I think so. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. So I deal with the second half of the 20th century. So more important women for me are Margaret George, Josephine Warda, who's the president of the Iraqi Women's League, associated with the Iraqi Communist Party in Kirkuk. So I don't deal with the first half so much and the interwar period. But Surma Khanum is interesting. I mean, let's just contrast her with Margaret George. Margaret George is I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with her. She's considered to be the first Peshmerga fighter. She's an Assyrian. She joins the Kurdish uprising with originally with her father and some other male relatives. She's from the Barwa region. 1961. 1961. And she eventually, and her family, works within the KDP, basically. At this time, there's a lot of Assyrians who are joining the Iraqi opposition, and I argue that we should look at the space, to be more than just through the nationalist Kurdish lens, because there's a lot more going on. There are communists who are escaping the central towns and villages, who are being massacred after Qasim's replacement in 1963. This is when the Ba'ath take over the first attempt, and then they don't, it does not work out for them so much, but Arab nationalists are taking over after 63. And they escape, so those who escape join the Kurdish opposition. And then you have Assyrian tribal leaders, Assyrian intellectuals who are escaping, political, am I talking? Oh, okay. So it becomes a really interesting space where there's a lot of intercommunal, inter-ideological sort of, anyways. So she's a very complicated figure. She is someone who leads men. She's a fighter. She leads men. She's compared to she's called the second Shamiran by the Assyrians. She's called the Joan of Kurdistan by Kurds and others in Europe, and she became quite famous. And there's a cult that revolves around her, which at a time is, they're seeking to have support from Western powers and so on and so forth. So they publicize her image because she makes them look good, basically. But I mean, if you look at Surma Khanum compared to her, Surma Khanum is, I'm not an expert in the second half of the first half of the 20th century. Maybe Fadi Dawood can talk more about it. But from what I can see, she's quite respected. She's someone who comes from the patriarchal family. So sure, she has some leadership roles, but I think we need to put it in context. And the context is that she comes from a religious family. So, there are certain benefits that she has to her advantage. Whereas Margaret George, she's as active, but then she's sexualized. There's a lot of more gender-related, problematics involved with her and other women than with Surma Khanum. But Surma Khanum is a very important figure as well, of course, and who deserves a lot more analysis and discussion. Yes, thank you.
Okay, I want to add, Sabri, another. Was it me? It's my turn, isn't it?
Yeah, it's your turn.
Yes. I want to add one example compared to the situation of Yad Sadeh. From my village, Medan, a lady who brought her son with her to the village, who lived with her, and she never married again. And he became a diakon, Shamosho. And then he went to Kamishli, and he died in Kamishli just some years ago. So you have another examples too. So a lady bringing her son, but of course after they killed her husband. This is, it may be the difference. So she came with her Muslim son, he became a Christian, and the relatives of her husband accepted it, and they have good relations. This is what we hear. Another issue which I wanted to say regarding the gender issue, we had a conference just 2 weeks ago here at the Technical University of Berlin, dedicated to the gender issues in the Armenian genocide. Although it was the same issue, sometimes comparable examples colleagues have brought and discussed. I think it would be interesting to show the results of that conference. These 2 points I wanted to mention. I think it is important to know them.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond to, or a bit to add to Sonar's comment and Alda's comment about Surma. Interestingly enough, Surma Khanum's sort of role becomes increasingly more important as she befriends the Anglican missionaries and Anglican church officials in London. And she actually travels to London multiple times to speak to Anglican missionaries or Anglican church officials about the role of Assyrians. And there are actually secret documents in the British Archive, if you look through them, where they actually say, with the promise of an Assyrian homeland, she could become the first female head of a state. And so her role is actually, I think, a bit different, because we always have to understand that the individuals Alda is talking about are actually influential female figures in their own right, in the sense that they are influential figures within the community. Surma's role becomes increasingly more important as colonial officials see her in this so there's a different type of analysis that has to be applied to her, and we have to be a bit more careful in the way we actually situate her due to the colonial relationship or the colonial nature of the relationship between her and the British colonial officers and between her and the community in of itself. And I think Helene...
Yeah, maybe just one thing to add, that one of the reasons that she became so important in that period is because she spoke good English, and that started long before, because she was a student of Wigram and the other missionaries. So this whole colonial series leads up to her special role, which indeed is different from Margaret.
Right, but she's also working with an accepted. She's not, as far as I know, she's not really challenging patriarchal notions so much. She's working with an accepted mediums, right? It's a colonial role. It's her family. It's a church. It's So she's not really challenging any. Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, she is trying to reinforce those traditional roles in order to preserve it for her, for Marsharoon, who's very young at the time. Mm-hmm. So it's very different from those people who are trying to break the chains of patriarchy that we're talking about in the instances after the 1930s and 40s. Those are different. So we always have to be careful, because people bring Surma Shamroon and they say, well, she's a model of a strong female. Yes, she was a strong female, but the reason she's a strong female is completely different than other strong females that we see later on, like fighters or political thinkers, etc. She's just different. And we have to always be careful of that.
Could I just, Fadi, it's very important to remember, of course, that Marshimun was 13 when he became patriarch, and so she would have assumed a guardian role, etc. And of course, the whole question of the role of women. If you think of Benazir Bhutto, she'd never have become president of Pakistan had she not belonged to a certain family. So family plays a very big role generally, and shouldn't just be localized to the Assyrian communities, etc. Who your family is would dictate what your chances were. She happened to be in the patriarchal family. But I do think that she assumed her mentorship role because the patriarch was so young when he had to assume that office, against probably who knows what his real inclinations were too.
I'm not arguing, against that. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add something. Let's not forget that at that time, the Assyrian community at Baquba refugee camp was divided into two camps. Those that supported the patriarch and Surma, and those who didn't. And, both sides were actually sexualizing or objectifying the females on the other side. So, for example, Surma, there are stories from the side that was against the patriarch that Surma, this is obviously slanderous, but that Surma was, for example, that she got pregnant with one of the British Army officers and that she had an abortion. Then there's the other side, Surma's side, vilifying Agha Petros, calling him the son of a widow, because they didn't like him and they tried to. But I had a couple of other comments for Malfono Sabri and Dr. Hunter. Dr. Hunter, you mentioned the sale of the manuscript in, I think it was 1901 to the BN.
That was a manuscript that was copied from the Urmia collection. That was not a Sirt copy. The
Sirt manuscript that was sold to the Bibliothèque Nationale.
No, that was sold to the Bibliothèque Nationale.
When was that?
I think that it was sometime before the First World War.
I was going to say, because my theory is, obviously, the Marad Desher built a new cathedral and opened it up in 1895 with a big new diocesan center and the residence for the bishops. And I think he must have been in debt, which is why he sold the manuscript to the Bibliothèque Nationale.
But he wasn't consecrated until 1902.
The church.
Yeah, but Adai was not consecrated bishop until 1902.
No, he was Archbishop of Sirte before then.
No, he was consecrated in
That's
1902.
We can talk about that. Or maybe it was a later date, but anyhow. Malfouna Sabri, just a second story relating to that of Malfouna Shabo. I was interviewing a 90-year-old man who is from Tchouma in Melbourne, and he told me that in their village in Syria, he remembers growing up with someone he called Mikhail Turkaya, Michael the Turk. And the story was that his mother had been raped during the genocide, and she actually had this baby, and she brought him with her, even though his father was a Kurd or a Turk, or she wasn't even sure who the father was, but she still raised him as an Assyrian. And he was accepted by the community, even though they jokingly referred to him as Michael the Turk. So he was still accepted and drawn into the community. He wasn't rejected at all, and she didn't reject her son. So just a second Malfouna Shabo's story.
Can I answer? Yeah, I interviewed Khori Lahto from Gronau in Germany some years ago. And he served in Adiyaman for 15 years. And during the 15 years, he converted back 712 people to Christianity, and they were Armenians and Assyrians. Many of these women, still their grandchildren, they don't know they were Assyrians and Armenians. During the day, they are Muslims. During the night, they are Christian.
Something? Yeah, please. You,
I had a last important question, I think, especially if you think about the abduction of females. What about the forced Islamization of women and the children? I think this is a subject we didn't discuss so much. And some of them, as you mentioned, now return. Not only that, but we have from the village of Midin, we have an old Khori here in Berlin who baptized many from the eastern side of the Tigris, from the Botan region, even until Sirte region in the 70s. And I remember myself when I was a child in the learning Syriac in the church, people coming and kissing the hand and the clothes of the priest, Baba Khasha, yeah? So it was that in that year 74, 5, 6, where many of them returned to Christianity and have been baptized secretly by the priest from our village. But now back to the forced Islamization, especially regarding the women and the girls and children, they have been taken or abducted.
Of course, during the genocide, as I mentioned, many Kurds and Turks, they took advantage to take the Assyrians, Armenian girls and women to convert to Islam, and it was forced assimilation, they were forced to be Muslim, and in this way they could escape the genocide. But we have many examples that many Assyrian women and Armenian, they prefer to get suicide than to be converted to Islam. And as Soner mentioned earlier, Kemal Yalchin, he interviewed many Turks, Kurds, and they mentioned that they were Assyrian and Armenians. And to escape the genocide, they converted to Islam. And the numbers, we don't have exact number, but there are some says that around 800,000 people, they were converted to Islam.
2 million people, they are speaking about 2 million converted in
So, dear guests, it seems there are no more questions or remarks today, and so I'm glad and proud to close this session. Thank you very much to the speakers today, and thank you very much to you.